According to a source familiar with the incident, the two survivors climbed back onto the boat after the initial strike. They were believed to be potentially in communication with others and salvaging some of the drugs. Because of that, it was determined they were still in the fight and valid targets. A JAG officer was also giving legal advice.
Okay, so that's ABC's Martha Raddatz, and you tweeted out that clip and you wrote, "It's all premeditated murder. Every one of the killings, not just these two. ABC and Raddatz are just reading propaganda." So can you expound on that and what you're referring to here?
Yeah, I could see that I spelled two wrong. But, well, I mean, on any number of levels, I mean, the whole thing, one is she's just repeating, what the sources in the Pentagon are saying, but she's, of course, assuming that it's a legal operation. I mean, even if they were climbing back onto the boat, it's still premeditated murder. There's no, it's kind of like Alice in Wonderland. First the execution, then the accusation, then the trial. I mean, it's like, it's really head spinning the way that clip just took this, which is really just a series of premeditated killings, going back to the first one on September 2nd, all of them, not just the ones that people are focusing on now of these, the so-called second tap. It's all just murder. And Raddatz, ABC News, it's confirming the narrative that we're at war. It's suggesting that there might be some mitigating circumstances that explains why we hit the boat twice. I mean, the whole thing should be condemned as just out and out illegal. I mean, who was it? I mean, I hate to cite George Will, but it's, Hegseth and Trump. These are war criminals without a war.
Can you walk us through a little bit what Trump is doing right now vis-a-vis Venezuela and what is motivating him?
Well, there's any number of things that are motivating. The big picture is that for American First movement, right, that imagines the world, the United States no longer superintends a global liberal, quote unquote, political economy in which everybody plays by the rules, but the United States retreats into a kind of territorial region in which it sees its own interests. That's happened in the past, and Latin America is key to that, right? If you're gonna America First and the Monroe Doctrine have gone hand in hand together since both terms were coined. There's this sense that Latin America has to be organized, and we see it in his actions in Honduras, and Argentina, Ecuador, El Salvador. We can go into all of them. But then, of course, there's Venezuela and there's oil, but there are no material interests that aren't always already created by ideology. There's lots of ways to get Venezuela's oil. You can sign a bunch of contracts and get Chevron to pump the oil. It wouldn't be that big a deal. What's going on is that there was a split within the Trump administration between so-called, believe it or not, moderates. I mean, it's all relative. These are relative terms, but people like Richard Grenell, who he's an American firster, but he's very tied to Chevron, and he had negotiated a series of exemptions for Chevron to start pumping oil, which they did just a couple of weeks before the speedboat attacks. And I think those speedboat attacks was the war party, Miller, Rubio, the head of the DEA, Hegseth, attempt to preempt any normalization of relationships with Venezuela. And with Rubio, it's a kind of a confluence of two different strands. One is he's a neocon, right? Before he became an American firster, he was hot for Iran, and of course the Gulf War and everything. But he's also from South Florida. And right. He's got deep ties to the Cuban community, and Venezuela is seen as the first step towards taking out Cuba, denying it its oil, so he represents a faction of the Trump administration that sees getting Latin American organized in order as much more of an ideological project, right? Bringing bringing a certain kind of anti-communism updated with the cultural war slop that that's drowning the United States into Latin America. And so, he's doing it under the rubric of the war on drugs, which of course is not Donald Trump. That's a 50-year war. Behind every single horror that Donald Trump represents exists a long train of U.S. presidents that have first put in the policies that make what Trump does today possible. And there's nowhere clearer than that than the drug war, which started formally with Richard Nixon in 1973. So there's many things flowing into it, and you see them kind of bouncing around now and flailing around because they're not really quite sure. And certainly this overstepping with the cold-blooded murder and the joking about killing these people trying to get back on the thing has really blown back on them, because I guess even some of the hardest hardliners understand that the rules of law are there for a reason.
When Pete Hegseth was defending himself, he says that, first of all, he wasn't in the room when the follow-up strike happened on the survivors of the initial strike. He wasn't there. He also said that this was just the fog of war.
I did not personally see survivors, but I stand, because the thing was on fire. It was exploded in fire or smoke. You can't see anything. You got digital. This is called the fog of war. This is what you in the press don't understand. You sit in your air-conditioned offices or up on Capitol Hill and you nitpick and you plant fake stories.
And I'm curious, like, what, as a historian, what you thought when you heard a attempted offense in the name of the so-called fog of war.
Well, there's no war. That's the first thing. And there wasn't any fog. You could see them very clearly. So it's a metaphor fails on both counts. I don't know what's driving the cruelty. I don't know what's driving the mania. Hegseth seems to be a certain kind of crazy beyond anything that I can understand. Maybe it's the drinking. Maybe it's he thinks he's in a reality show with laws of war, or any kind of law applies to him. But he seems out there, beyond even some of the worst Trump people. I mean, Trump himself obviously is bad, and they take gratuitous cruelty in doing what used to be done covertly. Again, right? A lot of this stuff is a bipartisan consensus: the war on drugs, the isolation of Venezuela, the economic sanctions on Venezuela, the use of the war on drugs as a way of projecting U.S. interests. All of these things are, have been bipartisan policies and obviously deportations. What Trump does is that he takes them and he turns them into spectacle. And a good chunk of that is the cruelty. The U.S. drug war is what's famous about the U.S. drug war is, Trump is almost a perfect encapsulation of the catch-22 logic of the U.S. drug war. On the one hand, the CIA has in the past worked with repressive military regimes that were deeply involved in cultivating coca and cocaine production. You can go back to Pinochet, go back to the Bolivian colonels and generals in the 1970s, and you go back to Uribe under Plan Colombia. And at the same time, these very same generals are taking millions of dollars from the DEA to fight drugs. So this kind of tension between using drugs, as a kind of linchpin of an anti-communist coalition, and the profits from them to fund covert activities, right? Which Iran-Contra in the 1980s, that attempt to isolate and destabilize the Sandinistas was one of the most famous examples, where tens of millions of dollars of money from the Medellin cartel went to fund the Contras, and of course the planes went back and forth carrying cocaine into the United States and carrying arms back into Honduras to give to the Contras. But so Trump in many ways represents the pure encapsulation of that. On the one hand, he's threatening to wage a war on Venezuela because of drugs. On the other hand, he's pardoning Orlando Hernandez, from the former imprisoned, now free president of Honduras, who was, deeply involved in exporting cocaine into the United States. So he's, again, like with everything else, he just takes everything that the United States has been doing in the past, and he does it one to an more intense degree, and he does it publicly with, and he's, so in many ways he's very useful because he's revealing the dynamics that are behind it.
Well, I wanted to ask you more about that because Trump waging this regime change war against Venezuela in the name of fighting narco traffic, and then in the name of fighting narco trafficking, and then as you said, pardoning a convicted narco trafficker, the former president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, accepted a $1 million bribe from the drug kingpin El Chapo, bragged about stuffing the drugs up the gringos' noses. There was a man murdered in prison in a murder that was connected to his case, obviously to the allegation there is that this man was killed because he could incriminate this former Honduran president. Talk to us more about this, and maybe start with the coup in Honduras back in 2009, and which was backed by the U.S., or at least accepted by the U.S., and how that leads us to where we are today.